As time moves on, it becomes even more clear. It seems that this is going to be a done deal and is inevitable. Texas, Oklahoma to the SEC, the biggest college football story in how long? We will attempt to answer that question and many, many others. Please leave your comments and questions in the comment section here at the Voice of College Football and our weekly Oklahoma show, edition number 12, and a bit of a special one here with Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. Jason, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I know we were all set to talk about Big 12 linebackers this week, but as you've seen across the country, I think everybody has been, kind of put on edge and kind of, it's very surreal. I mean, to even kind of think about a change this seismic in college football athletics that's happening right now. But to your point, it almost seems like it's a not if, it's more of a when type of situation right now.
Jason and I got together with Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football yesterday, so please check out that live stream. We had some tremendous insight and conversation unveiled during that discussion, so go to the main channel. You can check out my conversation again with Jason, Tony, and Steve Helwick from SB Nation joined us as well. All right. So, yeah, with each passing hour comes not necessarily more information, but just comes more speculation of what could happen affecting schedules and formation of the league. And, of course, the domino effect to the other leagues. And will they respond? How do they respond? Let's start big picture, huge picture. With something that you brought up, something that's been on my mind today, and I've actually alluded to, in a sense, not to make a bold statement that this is for sure the biggest news in college football in forever, but then you brought it again to me as we prepared for the show, and this is the biggest news in college football for a long, long time, and I'm trying to search for the last news that would supersede this move, because again, it's not just about Oklahoma and Texas, two of the top 5 to 10 programs in the sport moving to the best conference, but everything else that's going to have to take place because of this, and how many schools it's going to affect, how many football programs, and whether the SEC is just going to completely steamroll college football, or if the Big Ten, the ACC, the other conferences will respond or join in some fashion to counter this.
Yeah, Mark. I mean, I think you hit it on the head. You have to think that the other conference will respond in some way. Not sure what way that will be. Obviously, whether it's picking up a team or here and there just to kind of hold serve with the SEC, if you will. Now, when you look back at this, I think when you look at from Oklahoma's perspective, from Texas' perspective, and even from the fans' perspective, I think it's exciting to think about. Now, I tend to concur with you from what you'd mentioned yesterday. This isn't necessarily great for the sport overall in terms of really kind of the balance of power. I mean, you still have, obviously, you have Ohio State from a Big Ten perspective. They're not going anywhere. You have Clemson from an ACC perspective. They're not going anywhere. But when you think of like you mentioned, the blue bloods in one conference, such as an Alabama, such as a Georgia, and you bring Oklahoma and Texas in there, and you have Florida, you have clearly, I mean, not even close, the best conference in the country. So now, where do the dominoes fall? Kind of, if you will. So I think first it's important to talk about the Big 12. Obviously, what do they do? I think there's varying opinions out there. Do they almost immediately fold? Do they try to scramble? I think first and foremost, I would anticipate them scrambling a little bit just to see what the interest looks like from some other schools. We talked about this yesterday as well. I think you make a call. Tony brought this up. I completely forgot this team. You probably make a call to SMU. You have that Dallas area, which would be good, beneficial for the Big 12, certainly. You probably make a call to Cincinnati. You make a call to Houston. You make a call to UCF. Just to kind of gauge, the intrigue, the interest from those schools, and then, see what that looks like. Because all signs had pointed to the rest of the 8 members as of yesterday being committed to making it work within the big 8 plus whatever they're able to do. Now, I think that a lot of the schools are looking at some contingencies. There was a report that came out this morning that Kansas has already approached the Big Ten just to see what kind of interest they would have. Certainly, you would expect similar, probably some similar things, maybe from an Oklahoma State related to the Pac-12, related to maybe an Iowa State in the Big Ten, maybe related to a West Virginia in the ACC type of thing. But yeah, I think so. I would say that's the first step. I think if it looks like that, maybe you see some of those American Athletic Conference teams, not interested, whether it's whatever that looks like, then I think you get to more of a contingency side of it, and where you look at some of these schools in the Big 12 really look more towards, okay, where can we best position ourselves to be successful, overall. Then you also look at it from another conference perspective, the Big Ten specifically. The Big Ten would just be adding a Kansas and an Iowa State just to have them. I mean, it's not really doesn't certainly from a football perspective, especially Kansas, it doesn't give them any added benefit. Iowa State is more of a with Matt Campbell, it's more of a rising star type of team in the landscape of college football. But it does a lot for basketball, certainly with Iowa State and Kansas there, but doesn't certainly do a whole lot for football as your main revenue generating sport. So I think it's going to be very intriguing to see where the dominoes fall and how they fall over something that's going to happen, fairly quickly. I think where we were at is kind of crazy to think about where we were at yesterday when we were talking about this, and then understand where we're at today. Where we kind of left yesterday was, the Big 12 was arranging a conference call with the athletic directors and the CEOs. All 10 members of the conference, as it states right now, were invited. Oklahoma and Texas decided not to be part of that conversation. So really the tone of the conversation was, what do we do to keep the Big 12 alive? What's the contingency look like? And frankly, I think some anger towards Oklahoma and Texas related to, some of the decisions that they were looking at and making. So, I think you saw a little bit of the writing on the wall there. And then you've seen some reports this morning that says, as soon as 24 to 48 hours, Oklahoma and Texas plan on letting the Big 12 know that they don't plan on, moving forward with the Big 12 at this time, certainly past the 2025 rights thing. Certainly we'll talk about that. Don't expect that to even happen to last that long. But it's almost like you said, like we talked about in the opening, it looks like it has went from wonder if this will happen, there's some legs to it, to it's almost you wonder how it could even be derailed at this point.
Yeah, for Oklahoma and Texas to reverse course, let's say, of course, they've made very much so their intentions and their desires known. So that's obvious. So it would be the SEC rebuffing those two. And I don't expect that based on what I've heard. Now, when this first broke, there were certainly people that came forward with valid arguments of why Arkansas, Missouri, Texas A&M in particular would vote against this. But as you look more at it, the more you understand that even though those schools and those football programs in particular would have issue with it, that most likely the powers that be within the SEC would be able to twist arms and, show them the ledger sheet to show them how much it would benefit them, and that those votes could be taken care of and would go in the right direction, that this would be able to go through. So if Oklahoma and Texas were, for whatever reason, again, the votes didn't go through, and they were turned back, just to be able to see them continue as a member of the Big 12 after everything that's happened and everything that's become public. It's just it's gone, to your point, way too far in that direction for those relationships to be mended.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. I don't think there's a way. It's kind of a relationship that has been damaged, beyond repair at this point. With it certainly being out there publicly at this point, you don't see. I would almost see Oklahoma and Texas going independent before they would actually continue within the Big 12 after 2025. And I think your point is very valid in terms of what the SEC vote might look like. I think behind closed doors, there may be some dissension and there may be some opposition, but I would be surprised once it came to a vote if it's not 14-0 or 13-1. That's just really the way, from a public perspective, I think that's just the way the SEC operates, and maybe overall just a lot of different conferences as well, but maybe the SEC to a greater extent, they're going to show a united front, I believe, and I think they're going to show a clear support for Oklahoma and Texas, coming into this. And when you look at from an Oklahoma and Texas perspective, we've dissected this so many times, taken it back and really looked at it. There's not a lot of negative, honestly, for either school financially. We know it's going to be a huge hit with the, specifically when you talk about a TV contract perspective, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, actually, that's been poured into this new ESPN deal with SEC over the last year, I guess I should say, with. And then, when you look at on the field, you would have to believe that recruiting you would get a benefit from recruiting. Oklahoma's done a lot better, here as of late, last few years in recruiting, but you only think that would get better for both schools. I think the one thing that would caution, and I've seen a lot of this through social media over the last couple of days, but the one thing I would, if you're an Oklahoma fan, certainly don't expect Oklahoma to come in here and start dominating the SEC at the same level that they have the Big 12. I think something interesting that I was watching earlier today, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, that over the last decade, when has there been a game where Oklahoma has lined up against an opposition in the Big 12 conference when Oklahoma was at a roster disadvantage from a talent perspective? I mean, maybe once or twice, maybe a Texas team had some better, more talented kids. Now, the first year in the SEC, you're probably going to go up, even if, let's just say, Oklahoma was in the SEC right now competing this fall. Certainly don't know what the schedules would look like. You would think at a minimum, maybe 2 or 3 games, at a minimum, you would probably be at a roster disadvantage in terms of pure talent on the field. So I think that the notion that Oklahoma's going to go in there and dominate is not quite accurate. But I think also the notion that Oklahoma is going to be 6th, 7th in the Big 12 isn't accurate either, right? So, when the conference alignment, it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. But, if you were to take what we were talking about yesterday in terms of, you have Oklahoma and you have Texas A&M, you have Missouri, you have Arkansas, you have Mississippi and Mississippi State, and LSU. Oklahoma's probably the leader in terms of, from a prediction perspective, on who would win that division. Certainly Oklahoma and LSU and A&M are right there with one another. So I think it's going to be incredible to see how this changes. And then there's obviously the playoff expansion is a big part of it. The NIL is a big part of it. There's so many parts of the changing landscape of collegiate athletics that are part of this overarching decision.
So in terms of Oklahoma and Texas competing in the SEC, I think this is pretty reasonable. First off, everything that you just said, I can agree with that. There's one thing to match up the teams in a one-game scenario in which you can look at the last 7 or 8 years and how has Oklahoma fared. They've fared generally well against the SEC, but of course they have not fared well in the two matchups at the very top level when they were facing a national championship caliber team. Alabama drilled them in the first half. What was it, 28-0? It got closer. It looked better at the end. LSU drilled them. But we're talking about, to be fair, those are the teams that you need to beat to win a championship. But also, to be fair, we're talking about the best team in the sport that particular year that they were facing. Also, we need to consider that. So Jason brings forth the talent. And I think that comment very much speaks to a situation in which maybe Oklahoma lines up against an LSU. And if you really want to grind through the recruiting rankings on the roster, and even though Oklahoma's been at that level for the last 1 or 2 recruiting cycles, if you look at the entire roster, actually LSU would technically have more talent. That doesn't mean they're a better team. That means that they have more measurable talent on the roster. And again, I think most people would agree Oklahoma is a better football team right now because of the quarterback position, because of developing the players, and because of the system in place. But just if you're talking about trying to handle a team that can run fast and jump high and do all those things on a given day, it can be very difficult. You can suddenly have an 8-4 SEC team be very difficult to handle if they're hot that day. And then it's kind of the accumulation of the games as well. It's instead of facing a TCU that's a really good team here and then having a couple of weeks where you're facing decent competition and then you got to get ready, Oklahoma State, more of that gauntlet that you see more so in the SEC Western Division that can weigh on a team that even if you match up Oklahoma against them individually, they are better. When it's Texas A&M, then it's Auburn the next week, then it's Ole Miss the next week, then it's LSU the next week, that the chances of getting upset increase considerably.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, so for people to come in there and say that Oklahoma's not going to take some lumps early on, I think that's fair to say. I mean, they're certainly going to take some of those lumps. Now, it's not going to be a considerable lump. Oklahoma's not going to go to a 6-6 or a 7-5 team, immediately. But I think Oklahoma has been, over the last 10 years, Oklahoma has been the favorite, certainly to win the Big 12 year after year. And I think it's certainly a disappointment, especially winning 6 straight. I think it's a disappointment for Oklahoma fans if Oklahoma did not win the Big 12 conference, especially this year. Having said that, I think those expectations change. I think rightfully so at the top. And I think a good, kind of expectation and maybe a goal. Certainly Oklahoma wouldn't do this internally, but just us as watching it from the outside in, for Oklahoma to win the conference, maybe one every 4 or 5 years overall, the conference. And so the one thing I would say about Oklahoma heading into this, I think they're better positioned to make this move now than they were maybe 10 years ago in terms of how much better they're recruiting, the talent level on defense that they've been able to get to. If they're in the SEC, 5 years ago, they might be throwing out a 7-5, 6-6 season, or maybe even worse with the horrible defensive play that they have played. So I think that's all part of the consideration as well. When you think about this move, and one thing that you mentioned, Mark, that I wanted to kind of hit on is something that I've heard a lot about over the last few years. Is not really the interest is dying down in terms of attending home football games at the University of Oklahoma, but I think the home experience has kind of outweighed that. We've seen, specifically into the pandemic year, that's a little bit different certainly, but we've seen Oklahoma's home schedule not be as strong, so a lot of people opted out on season tickets, choosing to watch things at home perhaps. And then, that's kind of continued a little bit into this year, more so than a lot of people anticipated. And I think a part of that's because of the schedule. So when you think about reinvigorating some excitement into the program, when you look at the possibility of of an Oklahoma facing an LSU, a Texas A&M, every year, certainly half of those games will be at home. And then, the schedule is much tougher, but I think it's much more enjoyable for the fan. For a majority of the fans, you would likely see, those people that are opting out on season tickets, they're gonna be standing in line to get back in to go see, Oklahoma host an Alabama, a Georgia, a Tennessee, a Florida, an LSU, whoever that might be. So I think that's part of it as well. So there's so many contributing factors. I think when you kind of take a look back at this and see how this happened, I think Oklahoma's a little upset with the 11 a.m. kickoffs being what they are. It is what it is with the current TV contract. But be that as may, they're still, I think, they've been a little upset with that getting more of their fair share. And I think part of it was this year with the Nebraska kickoff, the 50th anniversary of the 71 game of the century. I think that took a lot of people, a little bit by surprise and just kind of put more fuel to the fire. And, I think it's gone from there. But I think, that's one thing to think about in terms of the competition on the field and just the enjoyment for the fan interaction to be even better. Thinking about what the rivalries might look like. And, there was somebody, one of the podcasts I was watching a little bit earlier this morning was talking about how exciting would it be, Thanksgiving weekend, Oklahoma and LSU primetime on, at Tiger Stadium, for the SEC West, at that point, whatever that looks like. So I think right now there's so much excitement about the what ifs that are going with this. And still, having said that, it's still very, at least to me, very surreal that something this huge is really kind of taking place right now.
Got Jason Ray on the line, as we always do here for 12 consecutive weeks, talking Oklahoma football live with you. We appreciate your comments and questions. We'll get to them in just a second. We would like for you to like the videos, share these videos out on social media, bring folks in to the conversation. So know that we'll be here next week, 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central, so you can let people know that we're talking Oklahoma football. And depending on the size of the conversation and the topic, we extend that, of course, out to the Big 12, I guess now the SEC, and the nation. Two things I'd like to hit on before we hit some comments and questions in the live chat that are directly related to comments that you had made about the competition on the field. One would be that while Oklahoma is going to take a few more lumps, and anybody would joining the SEC, there's also going to be a larger room for error because, number one, we've got an expanded playoff that is almost certain to take place, a 12-team playoff. I've looked at the numbers, as other people have as well, in regards to the more than a projection. What would have happened had that 12-team playoff been applied during the playoff era? And 9-3, 10-2 is kind of that dividing line. If you go 10-2 and you play in a major conference, you were ranked in that top 12 or top 11 for the Power Fives, and you would have made the playoffs for sure. If you went 9-3, it was pretty much a 50-50 proposition. Now, going forward, if you're Oklahoma and go 9-3 in that league, you're going to be in the playoff, most likely, unless there's just a ridiculous situation. But most of the time, 9-3 is going to get you in the playoff. Not that that's where you want to be in terms of a record. So that's the difference between this situation in Oklahoma, basically only having that margin for error of one loss, as everyone else generally does across the nation. Number two, you talked about Oklahoma being in a good position to join the SEC today versus where they were 10 years ago. Well, the other program involved in all this, regardless of their brand, regardless of their name, regardless of all that, their football on the field better get a whole lot better, because if you took a composite of everything that's happened with Texas football since they stepped off the Rose Bowl field at the national championship game in 2009, I think it almost perfectly sizes down to a 7-5 season. They've been a 7-5 team since then. They're winning like 55, 58% of their games since then. Well, to your point, you take that 7-5, you translate that into the SEC, then they're 4-8, 5-7. So they're going to have to step up their game, or they're going to get embarrassed.
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. And let me take your last point first, and then talk about the playoff situation. And I think maybe this puts a little bit even more pressure on Texas this year. Certainly, they had some, coming into the year, maybe not a ton of pressure, for a first year head coach, but there's always pressure to win at a school with the brand and the tradition that Texas had. So I think this is a very, very, very important year for Texas. Not only, to your point, how does this set them up for a potential move to the SEC, but also, what does that look like for them, Texas as a program? Mark, to your point, are they if they throw out another 7-5, 8-4 season this year, which is probably what it looks like right now, kind of on the outside looking in here. How does that position them, in the SEC? Does that make a 6-6 team? Does that make a 5-7 team? So I think there's a lot of pressure on them from their area of, kind of thought process on exactly how well positioned they are. I mean, I think it's mostly about money for Texas right now. I think being in a position where they're at, how much money they have, and then I think, to your other point, Mark, about the playoffs, I think that's one of the other things that I've really heard a lot of commentary is Oklahoma would never, Oklahoma's not going to make the playoffs it being in the SEC, based on where they're at and some things like that. So I think the timing is very impeccable here in terms of when this might happen. I think the playoffs starting and the expanded playoffs starting, if it comes to fruition, and some extent would probably be in the 2023 season, from everything that I've read and heard, and I would think that pretty much coincides with when Oklahoma and Texas will be competing in the SEC. I mean, I think, I know we've talked about this as well, but the TV deal and the rights for the Big 12 ends in the 2024-2025 season. It's hard to imagine Oklahoma and Texas being in, what would be considered a lame duck conference, so to speak, in the way that it was intended to stay there that long. I think worst case, I think Oklahoma and Texas are in the SEC in 2023. Wouldn't be surprised if it happened even next year. Honestly, I know there's about a $70 million, $80 million, fee that Oklahoma and Texas would have to pay. I think, number one, you would probably see that settled out of court for not quite that much, for one. I think, two, I think some of the SEC overall would gladly kind of help in that aspect. And then I think, thirdly, wouldn't be surprised to see ESPN kind of help in that regard. Okay, we're maybe not necessarily helping in terms of paying that amount, but maybe restructuring that deal to where Oklahoma gets, there's a little bit more money at stake here for that contract and for the TV rights. So yeah, I mean, I think that everything from my perspective, just kind of thinking about it right now, and things will change obviously, but I would be surprised if it doesn't coincide with a 2023 season with a playoff expansion starting all at the same time.
We appreciate everyone on the line, about 70 or 75 on the line, and your comments and questions, and we'll start to pick them off right now. We see Patrick in Remington, 904 Hurricane, and Jimmy as well. So Patrick says here that Iowa State, Kansas, and West Virginia would look great in the Big Ten. TCU, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State in the Pac-12 looks nice. And I think that's been bantied about, and that's a strong possibility. The point I'll make on that, Jason, is again, there are no other Oklahoma and Texases out there. They don't exist as free agents. So one of two things is going to happen, and probably some combination of both, is that for any conference, and the schools being located where they are in the country, everybody's going with the Big Ten and the Pac-12 because you got to kind of skip over the SEC to bring them to the ACC. So the natural geographic connection is the Big Ten and the Pac-12, and I get that. That does make sense, and that's probably more so what's going to happen. But we can almost throw geography out the door. Unfortunately, I don't like it, but the way things are going here. I've also heard all sorts of crazy things about the ACC and the Big Ten getting together. So what I'll say there, excuse me, to Jason's point as well, is that the Big Ten, you would think, is going to counter this in some way. Now, do they just add to their football and basketball portfolio, and more so of a basketball portfolio? Because let's not overrate or, excuse me, overvalue Iowa State, because they're doing a great job right now, but this is almost predicated on one guy being the head coach versus can they sustain this? It has yet to be seen. So let's not overvalue that. But for any of these three conferences to match in any way what the SEC is pulling off, they're going to have to pilfer from the other conferences or merge in some way. Otherwise, they'll hold serve in terms of quantity, but not even come close to matching the quality of the Oklahoma, Texas merge into the SEC.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, to your point, just to pilfer from some of these other conferences, you got to think about, let's not, I know that we're not anyone here looking at that, but just kind of globally, certainly we're not undervaluing the brand of Oklahoma and Texas, and not understating, like, in order for the Big 12 to be viable from that perspective. I mean, you're thinking of, you're going to have to pluck an Ohio, and of course this is just, just kind of talking through this, but to be where you are at, you're going to have to get an Ohio State, a Clemson, a Michigan, a Miami. I mean, and I'm just throwing out some of these, Big Ten, ACC schools. I mean, just to completely throw geography out of it, a Southern Cal, a UCLA, those types of schools that you kind of think about that have some of the notoriety that Oklahoma and Texas has, and I think you're just not going. Obviously, you're not going to do that with an Ohio State, of Michigan, a Clemson, or Miami, or anyone, to that extent. So that's why, Mark, I kind of hold to the fact that yes, they're going to make some plays for some of these AAC schools right now. Probably that's probably their best bet if they want to keep the conference, viable, even to a certain extent. I think certainly it won't be considered. I know they still have that autonomy as far as a Power 5 conference, but I think eventually, whether it's next year, whether it's 2023, whenever that time comes, they will certainly no longer be viewed as a Power 5 conference if they continue to be a conference at all. And I think it just depends on what on what the conference is able to do in terms of who they're able to to bring in. If they are able to bring in even a couple of those schools, whether it be an SMU or a Cincinnati or whoever that is, I mean, and they could still be a very kind of a very high end group of 5 team, group of 5 conference, I should say, and so I think it'll be interesting to see how much they're willing to to go through that process. And I think one thing that's really interesting is we've not really heard any kind of statement from Bob Bowlesby or the Big 12 overall, other than we saw some snippets of what that conference call looked like last night. But there's not been a position that's been made by Bowlesby, and I think that's something that's interesting at this point, given the fact of where they are. And I think it's almost kind of funny. You can kind of think about it tongue in cheek at this point. One of the Big 12 media days last week, one of the questions, one of the last questions that Bob Bowlesby kind of talked through, and it wasn't even really a question, it was a comment, and he said something where he bet someone he won $5 because no one asked him anything about real conference realignment. And I think it was one of those things where he talked about that it's not something that keeps him up at night. He doesn't think there's a lot of momentum towards that. So I think it's just almost, and it just makes him look incredibly, and I don't want to say bad, but I think incredibly out of the loop on this, that he's not been close enough to anyone in his within his conference to know that there was a wind around this and this was coming. We talked about this had been discussed, how they were able to keep this quiet for 6-7 months is a kudos to Oklahoma, Texas, Sankey, and the SEC just in general. But it makes him look incredibly bad and just misinformed at this point.
It certainly does. I'm sure if it hasn't happened already, somebody is scrambling to go back to those video clips of his statements from Big 12 Media Days. So Jimmy is asking when the 12-team college football playoff would start. So it was announced when the proposal was released, or that there was even being a study put together and research to put together a proposal that 2023 would be the first year of the 12-team playoff. If it starts in 2023, they're just eliminating 2021 and 22 as possibilities. 2023 would be the first season that it could start. Remington is asking whether Alabama and Auburn could move to the SEC Eastern Division and Oklahoma and Texas join the SEC. So we had a conversation with Jason and a few others yesterday in which I posted the pod system that was displayed on the SEC network. So that must have some legs, whether they're just freelancing on their own, but they certainly are right there in the midst of both SEC and ESPN to have maybe some knowledge of what's at least being proposed or thought of on higher levels, not just proposed by some freelancer out on the internet, but by actual people that have some influence, which I think would be completely ridiculous, because I just think that that's too much information and difficult for the average college football person to just kind of keep track of. You're adding 2 teams, you get 16 teams, you get 2 8-team divisions, seems to be the best way to go. But yeah, because of the 2 teams being added are both from the western portion of the geographic footprint, you would think that they've got to kind of tear it up.
No, you're absolutely right, Mark, and I'm with you. I absolutely hate the pod, scheduling idea. It feels pretty clumsy and just awkward, just in general. There's so much confusion to go through and understand. Who do you play from this pod, and what does this look like, and what does it look like from a conference championship? Because it sounds like from everything that I've heard from Sankey is there's absolutely no desire whatsoever to move away from a conference championship game. So I think that's going to be interesting. Yeah, I think one of the most intriguing things about this whole thing, Mark, to talk about is kind of looking at it in terms of what does the schedule look like? First, you can think about the divisions, and then what does the schedule look like? I've heard some schools. First, let's talk about what the divisions could look like. I think I've heard some people more prominently, I've heard floating around that it would be you have Oklahoma, you have Texas, Texas A&M, Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, Mississippi State, and LSU comprising of the new SEC West division, perfectly as we have it here on the screen. And so and then you obviously you have Alabama and Auburn moving over to the SEC East. And my first reaction to that is uh, the the East division of the SEC would be tougher than any other conference in the country. Just that division, when you think about Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, every single year, and you're not even into the Tennessee's a little bit down, obviously right now, but and then you got South Carolina's in the same boat. So I think you think about it from that perspective as well. But I think I've seen some other people that have talked about that Oklahoma, they may split Oklahoma and Texas just to kind of integrate them into the conference a little bit differently. I could certainly see that happening as well. Although I did see while we were talking here, I just saw a tweet from Dennis Dodd from CBS Sports that came out and said that from everything that he's heard, that Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M will certainly be playing each other every year. So that kind of leads me to believe, if that's true, that it appears that is probably the former, and there'll either be a pod system or there'll be more of a traditional, what we had just mentioned here on Southwest Conference / Big 12 integration into one division. So, and then you kind of move over and think about the scheduling. I think there's a lot of different ways that they could go with this. I mean, you could go, obviously the SEC had a 10 games SEC only schedule last year. Typically, it's either, I think it's an 8 game schedule. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like, especially as you start thinking about the playoffs in general. What does that look like? Does Oklahoma play? Not Oklahoma, just the SEC, just in general. Is it an 8 game schedule? Is it a 9 game? I can't see them going to a 10 game conference schedule each and every year. That's just you've got to have a little bit of balance in terms of some lower tier Power 5 teams, it's some group of 5 teams, and obviously the SEC is very much noted for those November FCS games that they have as well. Like it, love it or hate it, it's just the way that the scheduling has been in place. So I would tend to think that you probably meet somewhere in the middle, and maybe you look at an 8 or 9 game SEC schedule with obviously playing everyone in your division, and then you have some cross divisional opponents every year. Probably 9 games makes the most sense, probably thinking about it from that perspective. If you go with to your point, Mark, a 2-8 team division schedule, you play everybody in your division, which gives you 7, and then you have 2 crossover games each year as well. So I think that's interesting to think about what that looks like. And I think another thing that's not really been talked about a lot, but I think from a scheduling perspective and from a rivalry perspective, I think this effectively puts an end to Bedlam for the foreseeable future. I mean, at the very least, an every year situation. Certainly, I think Oklahoma and Oklahoma State would certainly maybe look at striking a deal and playing some non-conference games here and there. But Mark, I wouldn't be surprised to see that rivalry happen exactly the way the Texas and Texas A&M rivalry happened. There's going to be a lot of disgruntlement from the Oklahoma State side of it, which I don't know that anything's going to come of that from the Oklahoma perspective. But I think it'll effectively end that rivalry for at least for the time being.
Yeah, I can see the same thing, and the same thing popped into my mind regarding the future of Bedlam and Texas A&M. There's some animosity there that has caused those two, after years and years and years of playing in the same conference, of course, not just the same conference, but being connected as the rivals for each other. Texas, Oklahoma certainly can be argued as Texas's top rival during that time, but they did play on Thanksgiving weekend. It was tradition. It happened forever. And then all of a sudden, once Texas A&M left, they never reached out to each other. There are various claims on who's to blame and who will refuse to answer the phone calls, but they haven't played since. And I can see, especially if Oklahoma State's put in a bad situation, they're already put in a bad situation, but if it doesn't turn out well for them athletically, that they may not want to play Oklahoma for quite some time.
Right.
For me, the 8-team divisions, they're just going to have to figure out how to better balance out the schedule in such a way. So if people follow the SEC or the ACC, it's the same situation in regards to you've got 2 7-team divisions. You play everybody in your division. So that's another 6 games that you play every year against everyone in your division. You've got 2 crossover games. You've got one that is set as a quote unquote rivalry. So for Alabama, that's Tennessee. And then the other game rotates. For LSU, that's Florida. The other game rotates. For Auburn, it's Georgia. The other game rotates. Those make sense. The other quote unquote rivalries they put together don't make any sense. I don't know why they have to have everyone have a crossover rival, because I can't think of 2 more disconnected schools in the conference than Texas A&M and South Carolina, and they are rivals that play every year. Yeah. So it seems ridiculous to me that you play this designated team. Kentucky and Mississippi State have to play every year. You play this designated team on the other side every year. Well, you can protect Alabama, Tennessee, Auburn, Georgia, etc. There's only 3 of them that I think need to be protected. And then the other ones, you can make sure you can build a scheduling format in which these teams will see each other more often than only 1 out of every 6 years. And it's going to be, unless they expand to 9 games, it's going to be 1 out of every 7 years that certain schools will see each other. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose of playing in a conference that you see a school every 7 years. And even with the 9 games expansion, it's only going to, in a fractional way, increase that. So I hope that they don't stay with this ridiculous cross-division rivalry, and that they can be a little bit more creative with the schedule to ensure that these teams play more often.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that was Oklahoma saw that a little bit in the Big 12, before A&M, before Nebraska, before Colorado, Missouri left. Oklahoma was seeing like a team like Nebraska. It was getting to a point where they were going to see them once every 4 years, to your point. So, yeah, I think and I'm not sure what that way is, but I think, to your point, Mark, there's a much better and a much more creative way to put that scheduling together versus artificially creating some rivalries that will, to your point, will never be there. You're talking about Texas A&M and South Carolina. Yeah, there's never going to be any kind of rivalry there. I don't know how this is going to work out. You could make a case. If you're manufacturing rivalries, you could say Oklahoma and South Carolina only for the sheer fact that Shane Beamer was a coach at Oklahoma for the last few years, and now he's moved over to South Carolina. But I think there's a more thoughtful way to go about it. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like and how you balance that out, but I think that's for the people that are much smarter than me to identify and see what that looks like for the SEC going forward.
Well, that's going to be my next project, I guess, during the off season. We'll deal with that, because I've built what I believe is an equitable schedule for all the conferences in conference, but that was the beauty of the Big 12, was everybody played everyone, so everyone had the same schedule. I thought that was phenomenal. I enjoy these kind of questions because I don't have the particular teams in front of me, but I can guarantee Mr. David Ferris, and it's a good point that you make. Okay, OU did not have much 4- or 5-star talent back in 2000, but played 3 consecutive top 10 teams and 7 top 25 teams that year. Could the SEC be tougher than that? Well, the only thing I'll say to that is the rankings are meaningful. The rankings are valid to a point, but let's not get hung up on rankings, because it's basically somebody determining that this 8-4 team is going to be in the top 25 and this 8-4 team over here is not in the top 25. So there's not a magical cutoff to being ranked and not being ranked. Like, for instance, yeah, if you're number 7 in the country, you're clearly a ranked team. And, if it's deep in the season, you've earned your ranking, you're number 7. But there's nothing decidedly different about the number 24 team in the country and about 10 other teams that just happen not to be ranked. So the rankings can be played around with, and they're not necessarily valid all the time.
No, you're absolutely right, Mark. And then this is a very good question. As you mentioned here, I think there's a couple of things to unpack under that 2000 year. So remember, Oklahoma was coming out of the worst, probably one of the worst decades of football that they've ever had in the history of the program. So, and even in '99, Bob Stoops' first year, they were better, but they only went 7-5, lost to Mississippi in the Independence Bowl that year. So I think in 2000, to a certain extent, Oklahoma took the nation and the Big 12 overall by surprise to a certain extent. And I think the other thing to think about is they didn't have a ton of 4- and 5-star talent, but they had a lot of talent on that team that, John Blake just wasn't able to develop on the field. And, Bob Stoops and Mike Stoops and everybody on both the offense and the defensive side of the ball were able to develop that talent a little bit, certainly a lot better than what the previous regime was able to do. So, when you think about, I think Oklahoma had called that Red October in terms of the October slate, that they had the back-to-back games against Texas, against Kansas State, and then against Nebraska, and to the point of how many top 25 teams that team played that year. So to say, would it be tougher? I don't know that I would necessarily say it would be. You can say it would be tougher, but I think it would be just as tough. Understanding, I think if looking at Oklahoma going into an SEC schedule, I mean, I don't think it would be, not knowing what that schedule would look like. Not saying that Oklahoma would have the same schedule, but it wouldn't be all that surprising to see Oklahoma play, 3 or 4 top 10 teams in a given season with the SEC, given understanding what the conference alignment might look like and what the schedule might look like. So I think it's hard to say that Oklahoma would play a tougher schedule, but maybe just as tough, like right around the same degree of difficulty would probably happen each and every year, not just that year.
So to clarify, in 2000, Oklahoma played a total of 6 top 25 teams. Also understand that one of them was in the national championship game, in the BCS championship game. The other one was in the conference championship game. So you're going to play a ranked team in the conference championship game like 90% of the time, especially in the SEC, like 100% of the time. So in the regular season, they played 4 top 25 teams, and that was a top 25 ranking as of kickoff. That doesn't necessarily mean that those teams maintained that position. I know Texas was number 11, 2000. I think they pretty much held that. Kansas State was number 2 in the country.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't finish number 2 in the country. I know that. They may finished somewhere near the top 10. I can look these up. Nebraska was number 1 at the time that they played. They obviously didn't finish number 1 in the country. And then they rematched Kansas State in the Big 12 championship game, and they were number 8 at that point. Texas A&M was 23rd. Okay. This question, Jason's been asked in a number of ways, so we can kind of compile them all together just in regards to the impact on recruiting. My 2 cents is that Texas A&M has always been Texas's little brother. Well, that ended about 8 or 9 years ago because for anybody that's only been watching college football for 5 or 10 years, for them to differentiate the power or brand or status of Texas versus Texas A&M, they don't know. If anything, they think Texas A&M is better than Texas.
Yeah.
But going back for decades and decades and decades, Texas was clearly the better program. Texas A&M was churning out a bunch of 7-5s forever, 8-4 type seasons. I know they played 11 games, but you know my point.
Mhm.
And Texas was the one winning conference championships and national championships and among the elite. Well, that's not been the case for the last 7, 8, 9 years. And to extend that off the field, Texas A&M is recruiting just as well, and with Jimbo Fisher, better than Texas. So they are very much on the same ground from a recruiting standpoint now. And Texas A&M has just exploded in regards to facilities and the size of the stadium and money and resources and all that. They just threw $75 million at Jimbo Fisher a couple years ago. And now they can walk into any living room, and maybe the only knock against Oklahoma, Texas would be that we haven't won in 10 years. But for Oklahoma, the only one currently is some recruits would look at Oklahoma. It hasn't impacted Lincoln Riley much, but I still think it's got to be out there to a certain extent that I'm talking about elite recruits. I'm not
Right.
talking about that would say, okay, maybe I'm going to choose to go to Alabama, LSU, somewhere in the SEC above Oklahoma, because Oklahoma is a great program. I really like Lincoln Riley and whatever position coach I am building a relationship with. But I hear all this stuff about the Big 12, and people kind of don't pay attention to it except for 2 or 3 games a year. And the SEC is just, they've built this brand in addition to just the football on the field that's just not tarnished in any way, that it's just the best. And everybody's paying attention to them, and that's where I want to go. Well, now that barrier's vanished for Oklahoma, and but that's been the one thing that has been in Texas A&M's favor and advantage in their recruiting battles with Texas, and I think it's been fairly noticeable and substantial.
No, I mean you're absolutely right, and I take my my glasses off here, and I look at it from Texas A&M's perspective, and granted they've come out very quickly and adamantly against this, and I think behind closed doors, if there's a vote, they're going to be an adamant an adamant no. And I get why, exactly to the points that you made, Mark, on how much they've been able to improve their facilities, how much they've been able to improve recruiting. So what's the difference? Why are they so much better at from a recruiting perspective now? It's the conference. It's the conference affiliation. I think it's the SEC. So the one thing that I think from a Texas A&M fan, you can hold over Oklahoma, you can hold over Texas, you can hold over any other Big 12 team that you're recruiting against is, come play here where you're going to play against the best athletes every single week. You're going to make yourself better. You're going to give yourself an opportunity to have an easier path to the NFL, so to speak. So I'm with you. If I was A&M, I would be against this as well. However, I think they're also a school that they think they have a lot more power than what they actually have. So yeah, I get that from that perspective. And we've talked about the recruiting will do nothing but go up. Oklahoma has lost some head-to-head battles against Texas A&M. They've lost some head-to-head battles against Alabama. Do they lose some of these battles now that they're in the that they're going to be competing in the SEC each and every week? I think it certainly remains to be seen. I think initially, Mark, they'll get a big bump recruiting wise, and I think from that point forward, how does Oklahoma's play on the field against the SEC? What does that look like? If they're first year, second year, they're in the SEC championship game, I think that helps obviously the recruiting and the playoffs. And you talked about this, and don't want to take us too far off, the beaten path here, but you had talked about this yesterday, and I wholeheartedly agree. As a Oklahoma fan, or as a fan of this general area, it's exciting to talk about this. However, if you're just a fan, you don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. If you're an overall college football fan, you're probably not super, super excited about this in terms of the balance of power. But, especially when you think about the playoffs and in 2023, let's say that there's, a 12-team playoff, and you have, this 16-team dominant league in the SEC. I mean, am I off base here, or is it almost a given that you're going to see 4 to 6 teams from the SEC in this playoff every single year?
The only reason you're not, well, you are, but the only other spots are going to be taken up because they have to award conference championships and a group of 5, and basically a group of 5, yeah. And somebody from the other conferences, unless things change, unless they, again, join forces in some way, you're going to have to be really excellent as a 2 or 3 seed from these other conferences to get a spot at the table, because, yeah, the schedule is going to be so overwhelming, the schedule strength. Yeah, Jason's alluding to a conversation we had yesterday that was a tremendous talk with Tony Siracusa yesterday, so check it out on the main channel. But I don't like this move. I just don't like it. If we could just, if it didn't matter where teams were located, if this was the National Football League and the 2 best divisions in the sport, or the 3 best divisions combined, whoever they are at the current time, and then they weighted down the NFL and then you could say, okay, we'll just take these other 3 and we'll slap them together so that they can match up. That would be one thing. But there's just so much tradition, so much culture, environment, flavor that's wrapped up in these conferences, because what are the conferences? Well, traditionally, they're just a representation of people and cultures in certain areas of the country. And that's what made it fun and interesting, and where there was a comparison even beyond the field of the Big Ten is this, the SEC's this. There's a different flavor. There's a natural rivalry and comparison you can make when Ohio State has to go down south to play the SEC, or there's a big bowl game matchup. It's just, and there was a different flavor to the Big 12, especially when Nebraska was, I'm going way before a lot of your folks' time, but Nebraska was part of the Big 12, and there was just that Midwestern feel. It was the old, I don't want to put negative connotations out there, but the Dust Bowl, the Plains, that was the Big 12, and then of course the Pac-12, and people snicker the Pac-12 now, but there was a time when the Pac-12 played a really high level of football, and it was Southern California, it was USC and UCLA and Washington, and each had its own feel based on, again, culture, and that's kind of been eroded to a large degree. And I think because of this, it's going to be even more eroded for the other conferences just trying to keep up. But it's almost like, I'll make the analogy to Major League Baseball, and hopefully I can explain this in such a way that the New York Yankees are typically better than the Kansas City Royals because they have this huge inherent advantage that they didn't earn. They just happen to be in a great location where there's 20 million people. So they just have the opportunity to make so much more money through radio and TV and everything else involved with marketing and sales in New York City than you can in Kansas City. Not because they run a better baseball operation, but they just have such a inherent advantage that they can just go out and buy players. Well, Major League Baseball kind of counters that by trying to share the money, but they can't do it to the extent that you need to. Well, this is taking 2 of the best programs in the country, adding them to what is decidedly the best conference, and the reason you have to share money in Major League Baseball is because the New York Yankees, they need competition. They need to play somebody. They can't just run a business by themselves. They're not a business unto themselves. Major League Baseball is the business, and they need everybody to be healthy because they got to compete against each other. Well, if the SEC becomes so dominant that they've got no competition, then it ceases to be an attractive sport, because basically the SEC championship game is going to be the national championship game.
A playing game, or so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely, you're spot on, Mark. And that's the danger of something like this. And that's the danger of, creating super conferences is you put so much power and so much, so much, and I don't even know the right way to put it, so much power on one conference, and then just so many teams. Because we talked about just a second ago, wouldn't be surprised, there's going to be years where maybe half of the college football playoffs are comprised of SEC teams, which isn't, and it may be a more of a regular thing than anything. So how does the rest of the country, how does the rest of the country kind of go through that? And I think, and I'll kind of go off a little bit here. And the comments here in this chat are just, it's just outstanding to me to look at, because there is so much, just thinking about bringing this full circle. There's been so much animosity over the last, I don't know, Mark, 6, 8, 10 years between Oklahoma and the SEC, and then Oklahoma and Texas. And number one, it's very, I don't know, uncomfortable, awkward to see Oklahoma and Texas so close to one another on this deal, when they're, one of the biggest rivals in all of college football. And I think more so, it's even different. I don't know if it's surreal, I think, is the only thing that I can say, is how much animosity there's been between Oklahoma and the SEC, and from fans and players alike. You hear everybody around the Big 12 country make fun of the "It Matters More" slogan, make fun of SEC teams chanting SEC in the stadiums. And we're, as soon as maybe a year from now of being in the same team, or in the same conference, and then looking at these comments, just seeing these folks really just debate back and forth in terms of what recruiting looks like, and what some of the teams look like, and who's going to be uniquely positioned. I think that's the part of it that I think is good for for maybe certainly the conference, maybe the game, just understanding that. But it's still a negative overall. And I think the one thing that I would point out is, one thing I heard earlier today, is there's some teams that are already kind of jockeying. There's some teams, I think Oklahoma State and Texas Tech were a couple of the teams that we thought, just kind of spitballing this, that may potentially join the Pac-12. And just, I think the craziness that you hear, I even saw someone tweet out, a prominent media figure tweet out a little bit ago, that it wouldn't be completely surprising to see the Pac-12 gobble up the rest of the 8 Big 12 teams and make a 20-team conference. And that just seems very, very bizarre and unlikely. But at this point, who would say that they're wrong, and things like that. So I don't know. I think it's going to be this season. You would think at some point we're going to get down to the games, right? At some point.
Well, the thing you just brought up seems completely ludicrous and ridiculous, but if the geography is already blown out of the water, and the Pac-12 is saying, okay, we need to keep up, we're in 5th place anyway, so we really are in a bad place. So why don't we reach out to what's the difference if they go get Oklahoma State and Iowa State than if they try to get all of them? Mm-hmm. And of course, Kansas is not the great football edition, but it's the great basketball. edition. And even though football rules the sport, there are a few exceptions out there in regards to some weight that can be drawn from a Kansas or a Duke or fill in the blank. There's a few of them that I'm not going to say they override football, but they bring enough cachet from a basketball standpoint to say, hey, to gain some attention and say we can add something to your league. But that almost seems ridiculous. But if the Pac-12 could almost feel like, you know what, we're saving the remainder of your league, your title of your league's gone, but we're saving the remainder of your league. And you know what? It seems ridiculous, but SEC, kind of fill in the blank. I'll try to do it in a clean sort of way. Basically, here's to you. We're going to one up you and try to do it with sheer numbers. I don't think it's going to happen, but and I know there's so much more than just the football, even though the football's king. There's academic status that some conferences want to say. Of course, we're going to hold to our requirements, and I've heard that certain schools don't match up with certain leagues because of that. But if the Pac-12 wants to compete, maybe they do say, we'll take all of you. And
well, and I think, Mark, that's almost the best case scenario for two specific teams in the Big 12, which we've not really talked a lot about. When we've talked about potentially like a Kansas and a Kansas State and an Iowa State maybe going to the Big 10. We've talked about potentially West Virginia making sense from geography perspective, and just teams that they would play makes sense to go to the ACC. Maybe they can rekindle that rivalry with Pittsburgh, and then you think of Oklahoma State and Texas Tech. Those are two schools that I've consistently heard that could be bound for the Pac-12. Two teams that I've not really heard a lot about is TCU and Baylor. Baylor is obviously a small private school as well. TCU's in a decent area market-wise. I mean, they don't give you a whole lot else other than that. They're in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. What does it look like for them? Some of these other schools, if they start getting picked up, I think, those two schools could be group of 5 bound, I think, based on, whether that's, the American Athletic Conference or wherever it is. So I think those two schools, almost more than any of them, Mark, you would expect them to be very active from a contingency perspective, going forward here early on in these talks and these negotiations, so to speak, to see, where's the best place for them to land.
It's a fascinating scenario, and the dominoes will fall in such a manner, I'm guessing, that not any one particular person's going to be right on where. I think we're all probably going to have a slice of a correct forecast, but not completely, because I just don't know. And the ACC and the Big Ten seems so distant geographically, and there just don't seem to be much connection there that there would be any kind of merge there to do anything. And obviously you got 28 schools between the two, so are they going to just shop off 12 of them and just be cutthroat and say our worst 12 are gone and we're going to be a super conference?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, the Big Ten is probably better positioned to be able to compete with the SEC than any other conference, obviously, at this point. I mean, when you look at it right now, the way it looks right now, obviously you're going to say that the Big Ten is probably the second best conference in college football year in and year out. So when you talk about super conferences, is that the way that some of these teams, these conferences look at it? Do we need to do we need to put ourselves in a position to be able to compete with a conference such as the SEC, or do we look at it from the side of from the position of we're just going to try to add a couple of teams here that maybe don't move the needle a whole lot, but it just allows us to be maybe a little bit more competitive, than they were in the past. So, it'll be interesting. That'll be interesting just to follow that as well. Are we moved more towards a super conference status here, or are we still a bit of ways away from that?
You bring up a great scenario there and a great conversation, because the Big Ten is traditionally conservative in their approach. They're not ones to say, oh, let's just blow things up and just grab bag whoever's going to help us in football. They don't look at it. They're academically minded to a certain extent. They've been able to balance to a certain extent the academics versus the football. A lot of people might be surprised that even though the SEC is clearly the best conference, even before Oklahoma and Texas, and the Big Ten, I would rate number 2. It sounds like Jason would rate number 2. And I'm not talking about necessarily this exact football season, but overall from year to year. There is an argument there. I don't think it's clear, like no discussion, forget it. But I believe that most analysts, people that follow college football on a regular basis, would rate the Big Ten number 2. But maybe a lot of fans might be surprised that the Big Ten is actually almost dead even with the SEC when it comes to money leading into this. Now the SEC's got a different deal going, but that those two conferences run the sport when it comes to TV ratings and attendance and money. They're dishing out twice as much money to their teams in the SEC and the Big Ten than the other 3 conferences are currently. So I don't know if the Big Ten just stands pat and says we're good to go, or we can just tack on an Iowa State or a Kansas or both of them. I don't think that's going to do much for them. Or do they try to make some major move and call up the ACC and say the only way we can compete with this is join forces in some way? It might be interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is why it can't be undersold, and I think we're there obviously in talking about how seismic of a move that this is for the overall landscape of college football. It's not just a couple of teams moving from one conference to another. It's a complete shakeup of the way that we watch and the way that we view and the way that we break down and cover these teams and these conferences and think about them overall. So I think the how the dominoes fall through this year and even next year to a certain extent. I think you would tend to see some of these dominoes fall fairly quickly in terms of, I think once Oklahoma and Texas, which from what we're expecting, as early as next week, will, tell the Big 12 that they're, essentially out. And at that point, the SEC will vote, and, if they extend an invitation and Oklahoma, Texas obviously accept it, then the dominoes start falling. And I think, I wouldn't be surprised if that stuff starts happening fairly quickly. And when I say, fairly quickly, within the next few months, obviously it might take some time for them to move over, if it means 2023 season or whatever that looks like. But I would see that these dominoes start to fall fairly quickly.
And really, I did a bad job there because I only made about half my point. What I was trying to get to was, let's say everybody pretty much stands as pat as possibly can be. So the SEC's got a 16-team league. Let's say these Big 12 teams, a couple attached to the Big 10, as we note, and a couple go to the Pac-12, but really don't change this power structure of how good those leagues are as football conferences, and then a few dissolve and a few go to the American Conference or whatever. But let's say it's an Iowa State, Kansas addition to the Big Ten, and it's a Oklahoma State, somebody, Texas Tech, Kansas State, somebody to the Pac-12. But again, it doesn't really change or match in any way the SEC's move, already being the best conference. The Big Ten could, if it's not forward thinking, be like, okay, this isn't great, but we're still going to be the second best conference, and we'll live with that. But because of what we've already experienced over the last 3 decades with population shift leaving the Big Ten, it's actually, I'm not going to say remarkable, that's overstated, but it's been admirable of the Big Ten to be able to keep up and actually excel with so many people leaving the North and moving south and moving west, that they still have huge population bases there: Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, etc. But people are leaving. That, and now with both the perception and the reality of the SEC being so much better, if they just stand pat, I think it erodes at Ohio State's stature, Michigan, Penn State to a lesser degree, as being able to continue to keep up. And for Ohio State, these amazing recruiting classes, when the student athlete's going to be more swayed toward, well, this is really where it's at. And for Ohio State to be able to continue to go into Texas and grab some of the best players in the state like they have been, and Florida, I think it's going to be even more difficult.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, Mark. When you when you talk through that, specifically from, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, to my point, it's funny because none of us really know what's going to happen at this point. I think we're all just kind of guessing. I think we all are at a point that I think probably all of us, or most of us on this call, on this chat, would be really surprised, I think, at this point, if the Oklahoma to Texas, the SEC doesn't happen the way, with all the momentum that's there right now. But if we think that we have an idea, all of us have an idea, but I think, to your point, that there'll be a little bit of a piecemeal in terms of everybody will have a slice of what might happen. And I think it's interesting to think about it. And I don't know. I know that from a basketball perspective, and from a baseball and a softball, certainly I think traditionally those are non-revenue sports. I think to a certain extent, some men's basketball teams do create some revenue. I'm thinking about the Kentuckys, the Dukes, the North Carolinas, the teams like that. But how much weight is actually brought in to other sports when making some of these decisions? Specifically when you talk about a Kansas to the Big Ten, that makes a lot of difference for basketball, but it doesn't make any, certainly doesn't do anything positive for the football side of things. So how much does that play into this discussion? I mean, it's almost a college football only discussion, which makes sense because this is what we talk about every single week is college football. But I wonder how much, from an administration perspective, they think about, okay, we don't need to completely think about football. We need to make it think of some of these other sports as well, in terms of what that looks like for for some of these teams. And as good as the SEC is in football, even with Oklahoma and Texas, they're probably still not the best basketball conference. You probably look at a conference like the ACC and the Big Ten still being stronger overall. But I think that's also interesting to think about. What role does other sports play? What role does academics play? What role does geography play? What role does all of these other parts of the equation play in terms of what this looks like going forward?
It is something else. And like you, I've been entertained by reading the comments in the live chat. I think we've got a bit of an issue with Jason's feed. Are you still with us, Jason?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you
Okay.
still hear me?
Yes, we just had a bit of a lag there. Just kind of sorting through these comments, trying to get to something that we need to address, because we had promised everyone that we will address all the comments and questions. Jason and I are here every Friday talking Oklahoma football, and we've had well over 200 people online with us. So where are you folks at every Friday? So join us every Friday for Oklahoma football talk, the Big 12, and again, we joke the SEC now. In future weeks. So we will be here every Friday at 2:30 Eastern and 1:30 Central. And somebody accused me of rambling a while ago. I don't know what I was in the middle of at that point, but that's could certainly be the case. I'm on here a long time every day, so at some point I do a little rambling. But all right, what do we have here? All right, got a Clemson question. We'll bypass that one. We've got other shows to deal with that. We got a comment here from someone concerning the Big 12 and defense, and just we've addressed this in the past, and it's tough to gauge completely, but there are certain ways to get a barometer on how bad the defense has been versus how good the offense has been, and whether that's changing and has changed. And Jason and I have addressed that in the past. There was a conversation I had yesterday, Jason, I'll serve up this question, that when Texas A&M joined the SEC, all these schools play with elite talent and tremendous players that move on to the NFL. It's just more about how many do you have and how really good are they. And so when Texas A&M joined the SEC, they got a bit of a slap in the face to a certain extent from a physicality standpoint. Do you think Oklahoma and or Texas are going to have to make any adjustments in terms of a physical style of play, even though the game's changed even in the SEC since Texas A&M and Missouri joined in 2012?
Yeah, so Mark, I think from a recruiting perspective, Oklahoma is starting to get there a little bit more than where they were, the last 5 years. I think the biggest adjustment is, I think up front on both sides of the ball, getting a little bit stronger and a little bit better. They've done that over the last couple of years with their recruiting, certainly, but I think they need to continue to do that. I think they're on par with a lot of these other schools in terms of skill position. I think kind of a funny quote, I saw someone tweet this out the other day, that Oklahoma's is looking to move to more of an offensive league than they previously were. But yeah, I think the biggest difference when I watch the Big 12 versus the SEC is really the talent up front in the trenches on the offensive and defensive line. So I think that is an area where Oklahoma will, and I don't know if adjust is the right word, but they'll have to continue to recruit those areas of offense and defense a little bit better than what they have. And I think, Mark, this season is going to be a big indicator in looking at where Oklahoma is. I think this is the most talent that Oklahoma has had on the defensive side of the ball probably in the last 15 years. So seeing how that manifests itself on the field is going to be big, really, just in terms of seeing exactly where Oklahoma is in the trenches, moving into this new era of college football.
Gators owned. Crazy to think that TCU and Baylor went from on the bubble in 2015, actually 2014, but we get the point. And in 2022, they could be in the group of 5.
Yeah, that's incredibly crazy to think about. Kind of takes me back, just kind of thinking about that season where they kind of got, I think there was a big discussion in terms of, should they have gotten left out, or should they, have been, right there and looking to be in the championship game. So yeah, I think that's it's one of those dominoes that's kind of interesting to see how it will fall. Because the Texas and our TCU and Baylor, they on the cuff they don't look like they're a great fit anywhere. From a Power Five perspective, but it could be one of those things where it makes more sense for them to be in a group of five conference, moving forward. So yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting ones to think about.
Yeah, this certainly has college football nation in an uproar in good and not so good ways. I haven't heard too much from the fan bases of the likes of Oklahoma State and TCU and Kansas State and Baylor and Texas Tech to see how they're feeling about the future of their football programs being in limbo. You would think that Oklahoma State would be best positioned, and let's say maybe Iowa State to latch on to a major conference because they bring a lot of value. Maybe I'm a little bit more concerned about Baylor, Texas Tech, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it was an interesting conversation that I saw yesterday in relation to with this conference call that they had with the members outside of Oklahoma and Texas. Who's the leader in that call? Is it Kirby Hocutt is there? He's served on the college football playoff committee. Is he the guy? And if he is, think about that from a Big 12 perspective. Do you have Texas Tech as certainly at this point as kind of your leader in terms of paving the way forward. But I tend to agree with you, Mark. I think Oklahoma State could very well be the team that is uniquely positioned in terms of they've been consistent and over the last 10, 15 years with Mike Gundy from a football perspective. But the other thing to think about is they've been very competitive in all of sports, all the way from football to softball, and looking what that gives a conference, uniquely. So I think that would also be, interesting to see. I think they would probably, from my mind, maybe West Virginia is another one that comes to mind as being, kind of the leaders to kind of push that forward in whatever direction the Big 12 ends up going.
We'll see the first scene that we'll see if it ever takes place, but I can just imagine, as you mentioned and people have in the chat, that first scene at an Oklahoma sporting event or Texas sporting event where the SEC chant goes out. I don't know if the old habits die hard. It's going to be difficult to break any kind of, for Oklahoma fans to actually have that leave their mouths might take some time to break into the conference.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll happen at some point. I think it's just a matter of when. It's just very ironic that this is something that a lot of Oklahoma fans and even media members here around here just kind of loathe. And I've heard, so many people talk about, no, this is not going to be what Oklahoma does. They're about individual school, not about the conference. So I don't know. I think it'll happen at some point. It may take a few years for Oklahoma to get indoctrinated into, into that culture, if you will, for the SEC, but it'll happen eventually, I'm sure.
All right. A lot of questions here that we have addressed, others that we address on a regular basis. So please join the show in regards to prognostications, predictions, talking about Oklahoma and how they measure up against the rest of college football on a regular basis. We certainly knock it out right here with Jason and myself every Friday, 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central, Oklahoma Sooners live right here at the Voice of College Football. And with so many on the line, we appreciate everybody stopping by, leaving your comments and questions. It's a topic that we have addressed all over the place. We had a large panel discussion yesterday. You can find that on the main channel. We broke with this news with everybody else. Finding out yesterday afternoon, and I've certainly posted things on our other team channels about how it could affect the Pac-12, the Big Ten, and other perspectives. We had a Texas guy in here, Nick Battle from Nino's Corner, yesterday to talk about the Texas slice of this, and you can find that on the Texas channel. And it's will continue in regards to the speculation about what this will do to the other conferences, what the scheduling is going to look like, how will Oklahoma and Texas compete, all those things we'll continue to look at, and we appreciate everybody's perspective on this. So please like the video, share the videos out on social media, let people know that we're here every Friday talking Oklahoma football. We would like to have this many folks and many more in the crowd, so come on back next Friday and subscribe to our channel here at the Voice of College Football Oklahoma. Jason writes for Last Word on College Football. And Jason, we would like to know what you've got working right now.
Yeah, so Mark, believe it or not, we're still going to play a football season this year, at least to my knowledge. So we've got a lot of previews of the Power 5 conferences as they state this year, certainly with some predictions and previews of what that looks like for the 2021 season. We'll have some stuff on this as well, probably early next week. And we're getting in the fall camp a little bit, so we'll start kind of doing some, as we will do here on this show, but from a Last Word on college football perspective, we'll also have some breakdown of what the fall camp looks like, some position battles, and look at some schedule previews in this year.
So folks, also, hey, you want to get set for the college football season, go to voiceofcollegefootball.com. That's voiceofcollegefootball.com. And you can go right to the store. It's at the top of the page. Click on store, and there you can see it. We've got just about everybody repped in college football across the map. So pick your favorite team and see what we've got available. Check it out, voiceofcollegefootball.com, and gear up for the 2021 season. All right, everyone. We appreciate you being here, and we will see you next week. In the meantime, check out the videos here. Go to Last Word on College Football and check out Jason's work. Jason, great discussion. Appreciate you doing so much for us over the last couple of days in particular.
No problem. Glad to do it. Thanks, Mark.
Everybody, actually, we've got a Miami live show coming up at 5 o'clock Eastern on the Miami channel. One of their best players, Avante Williams, dismissed from the team. ACC kickoff media days just concluded as well. So we will talk to Paul Scoop on the U about Miami football coming up at 5 Eastern.